your democracy is held up to us as an example. For us, that's simply miraculous.
We are much too comfortable. That includes the journalists. And I commend you for continuing to be chaotic and to press very hard for diversity.
There has been the critique here that because of the advertising dollars that go in to support the free press, that in fact, though we have a free press, it is a form of censorship.
On free speech, very little has changed in our country.
Freedom is much more precarious, and so is freedom of the press.
Neutrality of the press means death for it.
You must allow ideas that you hate to be published as much as ideas that you love.
Major funding for this program has been provided by the people of United Technologies, who provide a broad range of products and support services to the global aerospace, building systems, and automotive industries. Additional funding was provided by Tufts University, the Nation Institute, and the Freedom Forum, a financially independent international organization dedicated to free press, free speech, and free spirit for all people.
Welcome to another session of the Global Classroom. The Global Classroom is a cooperative U.S.-Soviet educational project that has been running continuously since 1988. My name is Martin Sherwin. I'm professor of history at Tufts University. I will be moderating the program. The subject today is the role of the critical press in democratic and democratizing societies. We have students from many universities in the Boston audience and from several universities in the Moscow audience to discuss these questions, and a very distinguished set of panelists in both audiences. At Boston, we have students from Tufts University, from Northeastern University School of Journalism, from Harvard, from Yale, from Simmons College, from Boston University, from the Mendeleev Institute of Chemical Technology in Moscow, and from the Moscow University School of Journalism. We also have with us today a very special guest, Dean Yasin Zasorsky, the Dean of the Moscow School of Journalism, who will begin with a few opening words of welcome. Dean Zasorsky.
Дорогие друзья и коллеги, я очень рад вас приветствовать.
I am delighted to welcome you here
I'll speak
from
English
Boston.
further. Dear friends and colleagues in Moscow, I am happy to be in this global room, despite we are divided by two oceans. We are in a way together, not only because we are looking at new ways of making our media, but also because our systems of press and education are getting integrated. And we have Soviet students from our School of Journalism in Boston and students from Boston in Moscow. It means that we are getting together in a new society, in a new way. It's important for us to see how democratic we are and how democratic we should be. I think this discussion will help this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Zasorsky. And now, Academician Velikov, to you.
Academician Velikov isn't here. Instead of him, I'm here, Oleg Botsov, chairman of the Russian radio company. Today, I'm going to be in charge of this space bridge in our huge studio here today. We have our young colleagues and students from the journalism department of Moscow University, from the Moscow Mendeleev Chemical Technical Institute, Tufts University. He's sitting right over there to the right. And together with me here at this space bridge, we have my colleagues, I think who are about my age or slightly younger. Vitaly Tretyakov from the left. Here, to my left, he's from the independent newspaper. We have Andrei Pankov from the newspaper Couranty. And we have Gennady Seleznov from the newspaper Pravda. And I am, as I said, Oleg Pavtsov. Anatoly Pankov, I made a mistake here. He's not Andrei, he's Anatoly. Great. We have a surprise here. Slightly late, here comes academician Velihov.
I will begin with Nicholas Danilov, who is currently professor at Northeastern University School of Journalism and the former U.S. News and World Report Moscow correspondent. Mr. Danilov is a student of the Soviet Union in many ways that I'm sure we'll talk about today. Next, sitting to his left, is Ellen Hume, the executive director of the Shorenstein Barone Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University, and a former Wall Street Journal White House correspondent. Next to her is Victor Novasky, the editor-in-chief of The Nation magazine, I think the most distinguished magazine of opinion on the political left in the United States. And next to him, you've already met Dean Yasin Sasorsky of the Moscow University School of Journalism. And next to Dean Sasorsky is Richard Brookhiser, senior editor of the National Review. I think unquestionably the most distinguished journal on the political right in the United States. So, gentlemen, welcome, and lady, and back to Moscow.
Hello, Martin. My name is Alexei Markevich. I'm a student from the Moscow Mendeleev Chemical Technical Institute. My question is, since I'm a scientist, in the hard sciences, we're used to doing with facts and things which have logical links. I think, after all, it's been said that everything is related to everything else. How do you understand freedom of the press in our world today in which everything is interlinked? Thank you.
Okay, a nice small question for our audience, and may I turn to the panel and see if we have a volunteer for someone to start out. Ellen.
I would start by saying freedom of the press means a press that is free to write opinion and facts as they are determined by the people who are writing and doing the television and radio commentaries. Hopefully there will be some truth in the middle of that. But the great struggle of democracy is to have citizens who are engaged enough to be able to sort out what is true and what is false. But freedom means that when you write something embarrassing or you broadcast something embarrassing, the official cannot haul you off to jail. That is freedom of the press.
To me, to have a free press, you have to have both the political conditions that you describe, and then you've got to have some way of providing for the economy of a truly free press. And the great paradox is, how do you get government intervention on behalf of a free press rather than government intervention against a free press?
Especially when a free press is doing its best work when it's criticizing the government.
That's true.
So that becomes a very serious problem. Nick?
I think another way of putting it is that there should not be any prior restraint or censorship of what is published. Now, of course, that opens up the situation to all sorts of abuses. Is the press going to engage in a campaign of pornography, for example? Is the press going to defame political leaders? Is the press going to take actions which will cause society to destabilize? In war, for example, to argue against going to war. These are all problems that we in the United States have struggled with, but I think the answer is no prior restraint.
Go ahead.
My name is Donna Chandler. I am a student at Simmons College in Boston. My question is, what have been the media images that you have received post-communism from the United States? Have they been realistic images, and how have your perceptions of the United States changed since perestroika, glasnost, and the fall, quote-unquote, of communism?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Who of our colleagues here would like to answer that one? 2 days ago, I came back from the United States, where I'd spent 12 days. This was my first trip to the United States. I think that our image of the United States and the coverage of life in America has nothing to do with what, in fact, is taking place there. For us, America is a terra incognita, I think up to now. It is really the great crime of our press, particularly the old communist press, which hammered away at us with one-sided, distorted information from a Bolshevik position. We still have to do an enormous amount of work in order to free our brains from this stereotype kind of thinking. On the other hand, taking advantage of the opportunity, I should like to say that the American press also has a rather stereotypical view of life in our country. I realized this also when I was there and when I carefully studied the work of American newspapers. Who would like to add something, please? I'd like to add something since I'm a representative of the old press, since Pravda is going to be 80 years old next year. Over the last few years, it has always had its correspondents in America and still has them now in Washington and in New York. On the one hand, I must agree with the point of view of my colleague from Curante, but on the other hand, I must object, because our press, after the 88, really has changed quite radically. Today, for example, our correspondents, both in Washington and in New York, are giving such quantities of material that we aren't even able, as we say, to process them and publish them. On literally all spheres of life, on politics and economics and foreign policy of the U.S. and life of ordinary people, you can read about everything today on the pages of our newspaper. And what do our readers think? I'm a student at Moscow State University. Today I read an article by Alexander Vasinsky about how we understand the United States. I think that right now we're having a totally reverse kind of process. If prior to perestroika we read in the newspapers about how the U.S. is the evil empire and how much injustice there was in this country, right now what we're having is the reverse. We've become a younger brother of the U.S. And your democracy is held up to us as an example. For us, that's simply miraculous.
My name's Danielle. I'm a student of Tufts University, and I was wondering how you feel about the levels of freedom that your press has. Since you gained your freedom, you seem to have become very critical of your own government, particularly Gorbachev. And I was wondering if you think that possibly you're being too critical and hurting the very government that gave you the freedoms that you have.
Thank you. Who would like to take that question of my colleagues? Or perhaps some of the students? Go ahead. Vitaly Tretyakov. Now, about criticism of the government, I'd like to say maybe somebody thinks that it's too strong. But I'd like to ask those students to try and come and live for a few years in our country with our government, and then you'll be able to see the kind of article that you'd be writing. Fine. Next, who else? Go ahead. Our newspaper has been called anti-communist and anti-Gorbachev. I have nothing against that, although we don't particularly call ourselves that. We had very sharp criticism of Gorbachev and the leadership a year and a half ago, and we still have that criticism after the putsch. Nothing has changed for us. Gorbachev is a leader, he's an ideologist and a socialist. We are categorically against socialism in the form in which it's been affirmed up to now. That is why the level of criticism is that strong, because our position rejects the position of Gorbachev's leadership. As for our life, well, it's true that I ran into an extraordinary fact. In the West, they defend socialism in our country, in particular in Western Europe and in the American press too, and politicians also. They do not understand what life in our country involves. They do not understand. I support Vitaly Tretyakov's invitation. Let those politicians who are defending socialism in our country come here and see what that socialism is. Let them take a look at the shelves in our stores.
Can I break in and pick up on a point that was just made, if I might? Because we're talking about the very important issue of the structure of society that creates the possibility for freedom of the press. And we've had a chance to look at the Russian Federation's mass media law. Now, it may have been a draft, but one of the points that is made in the mass media law, as we saw it, in Chapter 2, it talks about the establishment of mass media institutions and talks about the need for registration and for fees that the mass media have to go through in order to be legitimated. Is that true? Is that part of the press law? And if it is, do you people, both in the audience, the students, and the panelists, find that acceptable?
I think I should probably answer that question as a deputy of the Russian Congress. Yes, it is true that there is such a law concerning the press. We are firmly convinced that the law about the press, in fact, if we're going to be honest, since 1985, is the only law which in fact really works. Now, that's natural. It may be the only law which really has people who are willing to work for it. Its spokesmen are journalists. Now, as for registration, yes, we do have that because we've had an enormous number of media, of means of information. Today, they do not all belong to parties or to the party, as was the case in the past. Of 10 newspapers, 9 were controlled by the party in the past. Right now, the practice of registration does exist. And it's true that newspapers present their charter, they submit their concepts as to whether they do not go against the principles of the state, whether they're not carrying out illegal propaganda, and they pay symbolic contributions. From the moment they've done that, then they start officially functioning. This is incredibly better because a founder of a newspaper can be an individual, it can be a group of individuals, it can be an enterprise or a creative union or anybody. We think that during this period of the establishment of democracy for us, is in fact the foundation and the bulwark of democracy in general. And we don't see any contradiction here. Go ahead.
Would you be interested in hearing the views of the American panelists about the idea of registration, which doesn't exist in the United States? I'll take that as a yes.
Yes, of course we will. That's interesting.
Okay, let me begin with Mr. Danilov.
Well, I must say, from the American perspective, we would be appalled if a newspaper had to register with the government in order to begin publishing. I will make one little qualification to that, to say that American newspapers, if they want to get preferential postage, must register with the American Post Office. So we ought not to forget that there is a type of registration in America, but it's a technical registration. It has absolutely nothing to do with editorial content.
Ellen Hume.
Yes, I'd like to address both the issue of economic foundation for an independent press, which is something that Richard has talked about and Victor's talked about, but also to talk about the registration issue, which you've been talking about. First of all, our television stations are licensed by our government. That's a very important point. The newspapers are not, but the television stations are, and the radio stations. Why is that? Well, because through the science of it, the narrow bands technically had to be meted out in some fashion. And long ago, when television was first invented, it was decided that this was to be done by the government. So how do we have in this country a free critical press on television to the extent that we do? It is not perfect, but how do we have that if the government is licensing our television stations? We have it because we have something else that's terribly important. We have the First Amendment to our Constitution, which establishes such a sense among the populace and among the people who are doing journalism here that they have a right to speak out if they choose to, that it counters the forces of the government who license the stations. Not always, it does not always work perfectly, but it is a very significant part of the situation which you do not have in the Soviet Union. And I think you may end up with more problems because of licensing and registration than we have here, because we do have that constitutional power of the freedom of the press.
And I wanted to comment on the registration. I registered my own magazine, The Niagara, which is devoted to American literature and culture, and no constraints were involved. I understand that in the draft law of the Russian Federation, press is free to publish anything but appeals to the overthrow of the government by force, pornography and racial hatred. Otherwise, you're free. And I think it's, in a way, with all its flaws, and there are no flawless laws in any country, it is a step forward in the sense that it is a law which comes from a concept of not allowing but forbidding only very partial things, which I think not promoted in this country. I admire the First Amendment. I think it's wonderful when the government doesn't interfere into the media, and I support this in our country. But still, I think that the broadcast media do not come under the First Amendment in this country. That means that they're more limited. Their freedom is less, they're less free than the printed media. Okay, isn't it so?
Give Victor a chance briefly, and then we have to go back to the Soviet students.
We have a free press. Our press does not, our print press does not have to register in order to publish newspapers. Another journalism school dean, Ben Bagdikian, who was recently retired from Berkeley, the deanship at Berkeley, wrote a book called Media Monopoly in the early 1980s, in which he pointed out that 44 corporations dominate more than half of all of the information and entertainment companies in the world. And he included in that, and he was talking about the Western world, but he included in that newspapers, magazines, movies, VCRs, the entire entertainment and information community. His book was reissued a couple of years ago, and the number was down to 27. The Nation magazine asked him to project it to the end of the century, and he projected that by the end of this century, a half-dozen international communications conglomerates will control or dominate more than half of the entire knowledge, information, entertainment environment.
Thank you very much, all of you. I apologize to the Soviets for taking so much time, but I did it because I felt that it was an extraordinarily important point with respect to the structures that maintain a critical press.
I think that it might be a good idea for us to find out how, for example, our academicians look at this question. After all, they're very special people. I'd like to ask Academician Velihov to join our discussion. Well, first of all, I'm very happy that we are discussing this issue on our space bridges. I think that today, now, we've dropped that discussion as to whether the press is free or unfree, since our press today is just as free, I think, as the American press is. Now we need to understand what real freedom of the press is, and its responsibilities, and what an intelligent press is. I think that here there are several problems. One of the problems is the attention the press pays to things. We would like the press really to move society forward. I remember, for example, the American press when the nuclear moratorium began in the Soviet Union. For 6 months, the American press did not pay any attention to it. You ask why? And I'd like you to answer that question. Then, this is very important, because frankly speaking, it is through the press that such issues are resolved. In the press, in a free press, after all, in our country, in the past, the state of the press, I think, could be expressed very simply. In Pravda, there is no news. The title of the Soviet newspaper is Vestia, and in Izvestia, there is no truth. Pravda.
Can we have some student questions on both sides now? Let's see, from the American audience. Over there.
Good. Hi, my name is Ivan Farber. I'm a student at Tufts University, and my question is this. Knowing that the communist government in the past has not only abused the press, but abused the laws that they have created, how can you prevent in the future that any group or any one person will not abuse these new freedom of the press laws, specifically Boris Yeltsin?
Perhaps we can get an answer from the Soviet student audience.
I'm Vadim from Moscow University. I'd like to say that in principle, I think, on free speech, very little has changed in our country. Here, we have representatives of the independent newspaper, the editor-in-chief. We also have here the chairman of the Russian television company, Oleg Povtsov, who's the moderator of our space bridge. I think on the 2nd of October, he closed the UNIS, the youth radio station, which is very popular in our country. And he shifted that to the radio waves of Radio Russia. Now, I must say that in principle, there was practically no reaction to this in the press. People are silent. That's why the situation in the country, in the area of freedom of speech, is exactly the same. It's just the other way around. Right now, it's the democratic part which is dictating instead of the communist part. I'd like to warn the American side that euphoria here concerning the victory of democratic forces is premature. We do not have a victory of democracy. We do not yet have ultimate democracy. Democracy can triumph when there is an economic basis for so doing. And in terms of economics, we are still on the level of development of socialist feudalism. And that is why we cannot really talk about any victory of democracy. That's number one. Second, we also cannot talk about free speech yet. We have glasnost. That is an understanding in the communist spirit. It has nothing to do with genuine freedom of speech. First of all, we don't have freedom of information. My American colleagues have cited examples, for example, when they were deceived by governmental bodies, and then only a day later were they able to get information as to what in fact had happened in Panama when the American troops invaded. But if we had gotten information 24 hours later, I think we would have given very effective and rapid coverage. Sometimes we don't find information about administrative or governmental bodies for a month or even for a year. We still don't know the truth about many phenomena of our history. We don't know the truth about Chernobyl or the truth about the KGB archives and many other things. Up to now, this is still all closed, so what kind of free speech can there be? We also do not have a free market, in particular as far as paper is concerned, and other material resources. So we cannot have freedom for newspapers which are established by private individuals. Our newspapers, both official and informal ones, are established by the Moscow authorities. So how can we be independent if they have the right to remove and appoint a new editor-in-chief? A newspaper must, at least half the newspapers in the country should be private or belong to associations. Only then will the press be really free. So wait before you talk about freedom of speech.
Is there a brief response from the American panel on that?
On the question of your society getting mistaken impressions of America through your press, you should know that that's not the only distortion that goes on. A lot of people in America, and I'm sure Victor would agree with me on this, believe that America is not well represented by the American press here, that there are many consensus opinions that the major media in this country have, which many Americans feel are inaccurate. And the only way to fight that kind of inaccurate consensus is to encourage the widest possible diversity of press outlets, whether they be small magazines on the right, small magazines on the left, different kinds of television, forms of cable TV, which we're getting into now. But that seems to me the best way to fight that kind of thing.
Thank you. Can we have a question from the American audience?
Добрый вечер, меня зовут Сергей Островский.
Hello, my name is Sergei Ostrovsky.
5 месяцев назад я закончил театроведческий факультет ГИТИСа.
Months ago, I was graduated from the theater department of GITIS.
And currently I'm a graduate student at Tufts University. And I have somewhat a professional question to my fellow students at Journalism Department of Moscow University. I have a feeling that Soviet press is still being highly ideological. It's just that political orientation has completely changed. It used to be anti-communist, now it's diverse and mostly, it used to be pro-communist and now it's mostly anti-communist and very critical. Every reporter likes to express, enjoys expressing his or her own point of view. What do you feel about being a little bit more informative? Just give a little bit more information like American reporters do on what, where, why, who, what happened, etc. And don't you think that this is a phenomenon of Argumenty and Fakty newspaper, which has a 26 million circulation at the moment? Thank you.
Go ahead, over here. Well, I agree with the statement of our colleague. In my view, in our press, what we have mostly is a dominance of emotion and personal views of the journalist rather than facts. Perhaps only a few publications, such as the newspaper Kommersant or Arguments and Facts, or several magazines, somehow become more progressive, made progress, and stopped doing that. Otherwise, I think it's true that there's more emotion. Who else? I'd like to say I also think that we may get there. I think the problem is that right now, apparently the representatives of our mass media don't yet know how to behave in this new situation. I think they're looking for their own new voice. They're trying to find it. Although, of course, you can also say that the Russian soul always tries to express itself somehow, and that's why our press has such outstanding qualities, say, as press in the West. But I think we're looking for ourselves, we'll find ourselves, and then things will be the way they are in the West.
Let me turn to the panel briefly for a couple of remarks, and then to a student who's been waiting very patiently. Nick?
Yes, this has been a very interesting discussion, but I think one thing we've forgotten so far is that the United States and Russia are really rather different countries, and we ought not to forget that there is a cultural divide between us. If we don't recognize this, we're going to have all sorts of unnecessary arguments. What do I mean? The United States, for example, is a country which is located between two great oceans. It has no terrible warring neighbors around it. The Soviet Union is further to the north. It has 13 countries surrounding it, some of which are terribly unfriendly. This has an effect on the national psyche. Now, getting to journalism, we have very important differences. An American journalist tends to feel that he is the representative of his readers. His personality is of no consequence. His own ideas are not important. What his role is to ask the questions that his readers want answers for. I have the impression that the Soviet journalist is nothing at all like that. The Soviet journalist is an independent mind, a person who wants to express his ideas, and I agree with the speaker who said wants to express his emotions, or her emotions. And therefore what comes across is a totally different type of reportage. The American reportage tends to be factual, strives for objectivity and accuracy. The Russian tends to be much more political, much more full of philosophic ideas and so forth. Finally, let me just say one further thing about freedom of the press. And that is that under a free press, as we understand it in America, and again, I'm not imposing this upon you because you have a different history, you have a different fate, really. As we understand freedom of the press, you must allow ideas that you hate to be published as much as ideas that you love. And therefore, I think academician Velichov misunderstands the role of the free press if he thinks it's only a lever of government and only a method of pushing democracy forward.
Okay. Is there another brief comment? Nick, and then the student question.
A slight disagreement, because academician Velichov asked, why did the American press not cover the moratorium? Now, number one, I'm going to give you a free subscription to The Nation, so you'll see that we regularly covered the moratorium. And so did The Progressive and Mother Jones, and in these Times, and a lot of small circulation progressive publications. The real answer, however, is you are really asking, why didn't the major media cover it? NBC, CBS, ABC, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, New York Times, Washington Post. In my view, the answer is because we have a single-party press, and it is the Cold War party. And it still goes on even though there is no more Cold War. And it is informed by a set of assumptions which are daily becoming more outdated. And in that sense, it seems to me, Nick Daniloff, academician Velichov has a point.
Okay. Well, we're on firing line here. Now I must turn to a student question. I'll get you next time.
Okay. Hi, my name is Meredith Rosenthal. I'm a student at Tufts University, and my question is directed at the journalism students in Moscow. I would like to know how you see your role as a journalist, and now that all your information won't be given to you by the Communist Party or by the government, as I believed that it was, how are you going to go about investigative reporting? What kind of training are you receiving, and how do you see your role as a journalist in Moscow?
The question was asked as to how a journalist should work in the present situation. I think that each journalist must be primarily a reporter. Right now, there are an enormous number of information agencies, along with the official ones, Post Factum, Interfax. There are a lot of them. That's why a journalist, if he really wants to cover material analytically, if he wants to cover it the way he wants to and not the way any people who want to exert pressure on him want him to, he has to know what his sources are, what sources to use. I think that journalism today is a journalism of facts, which needs to be based on very honest work of reporters. Next, I think. My name is Dmitry. I work in the newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda. I'm a student at Moscow University. I think that the major task of journalism, the major task of anyone in any profession, is to help good people. For example, in the American audience, I see Nick Daniloff. I think that some people here know that he had to spend a whole month in the prisons of the KGB, and up to now he has never been given an official apology. I knew him well in the past. I interviewed him. I think that the task of a journalist, including those of the Soviet press, is to help him too, so that finally he should get an official apology, and so that this case should be formally closed once and for all.
Thank you. Joshua.
Yes, hello. My name is Josh Rubenstein. I'm the regional director of Amnesty International here in Boston. I'd first like to say hello to my friends at the Mendeleev Institute, where I visited this past year and lectured on the Soviet human rights movement. It's good to see you. Dobry den. My question relates to the situation in Lithuania and in Georgia. Today's discussion, we're all assuming that there's freedom of the press now in the Russian Republic, but we are learning that in newly independent Lithuania and in Georgia under Zviad Gamsachurdia, freedom is much more precarious, and so is freedom of the press. Are the big papers in Russia, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, interested in the situation in Lithuania and Georgia? Are they covering it? And is this worrying people in Russia that this could be the kind of pressure they will experience if there's social conflict and political conflict in Russia too?
As for coverage of the events which took place in Georgia, I wouldn't say that the Moscow and Leningrad St. Petersburg newspapers are not interested in that. Even the independent newspaper did publish a lot of good material. It even managed to be banned in Georgia at one point, although right now it's being published there again. If you talk about information within Georgia itself and freedom of information, that's very difficult. There is a newspaper called Droni. It could be said that about this newspaper that we have freedom of information in Georgia based on this paper, but I haven't seen this newspaper now for a long time. I know that about a month ago or 2 weeks ago there was a replacement of the editor-in-chief. Thank you, Vitaly. Well, this is a very important question that was raised. Unfortunately, we won't be able to have a normal discussion during the time of the space bridge, just because in the former Soviet Union there were 15 republics, and I can assure you that each of those republics has violations of all of the laws existing there, of every possible law. Journalists in Moscow, St. Petersburg, now cannot cover all of this. They cannot publish all of this on their pages. Don't forget that Soviet newspapers are still very small. They don't have enough room. They don't have enough communications. But right now it's true that indeed there is a real situation in which each one in that country prefers to take notes of those violations of the laws which affect him, his city, and his republic. I fully agree that the freedom of the press in Georgia, I think, is in a worse situation than in Russia. But the Russian journalists are not as concerned about this as they would be or should be. And therefore, this is not sufficiently reflected in our newspapers. Thank you.
Okay, can we take it? Do we have a question on the floor? Yes.
Добрый вечер, меня зовут Нина
Good
Клус,
evening. My name
бывшая
is
студентка Гарвардского
I'm a former student
университета
at Harvard
по
University
факультету женского движения.
in women's studies.
I'm a recent graduate of Harvard University in Women's Studies. I have a question for the women in the audience. I'd like to know whether you feel that being a woman is going to hamper you in your careers in journalism, and whether you think this situation has changed after the coup. Thank you.
I'd like to say that I think that it's very hard for us, for women in journalism. How I, for example, am going to manage to get to any kind of high position, let alone ordinary work, the kind of work that I should be doing. I think the situation of women right now in the country is very, very dangerous. After all, it's dangerous for women in the Soviet Union, and to be a woman journalist is even more dangerous. I think 2 or 3 times more dangerous. I don't even know how to express the degree of danger in being a journalist. So, just a minute, wait, over there. Then you. I'm on the journalism department of Moscow University. You know, I think that for a woman, it's much easier to be a journalist than a man. For example, I find it helps me. I can get that kind of information which not all men would get. And as for the fact that, well, you could be kidnapped or something like that, well, I didn't mean that at all. No. I think that women simply have to know how to protect themselves, that's all.
Can Ellen Hume speak to that question here, please? And then perhaps some of the prospective female journalists in our audience could speak to it also. Ms. Hume.
We in the United States had trouble introducing women into the corps of journalists as well. This is relatively recent, and I want to express solidarity with Soviet women who I know have a much harder time than we in the United States. You don't even have access to much health care, to birth control, and so forth. So I sympathize with you, and I say keep up the struggle. But as far as women being journalists is concerned, one of the things that's very important as you go forth is to keep that critical voice. Do not get comfortable like our male-oriented press in the United States. Be sure that there are voices from not just women, but minorities. And just to conclude that, I think that if you keep that kind of vigor, and you are a primordial democracy, and more power to you. We are an encrusted democracy. We are much too comfortable. That includes the journalists. And I commend you for continuing to be chaotic and to press very hard for diversity.
Thank you. Is there a woman in the audience who would like to speak to that question?
I'm in the journalism department. I'd like to ask a question of the American students. In the United States, are there newspapers with very clear political stances, for example, national patriotic ones?
Perhaps we can turn to Ellen Hume and some of the other panelists.
I think that you don't have in this country a direct political line that is considered the voice of the government just simply being put out on the pages, or the voice of so-called patriotism being put out. That is the voice of the patriotistic forces or whatever. No, that's not what we have in this country. But we have instead the major press, the CBS, New York Times, those major news outlets tend to reflect the mainstream establishment. They tend to try to figure out what the mass culture wants and to give that to them. That's why we get sensationalism. And when someone seems to go a little bit out of the line, as President Nixon seemed to do with using the government for his own political ends, and as Gary Hart seemed to do when he was running for president and was flaunting his marriage the way he did, the adultery issue, I think that's when the press engages and asks critical questions. But generally, it is not that critical a press. It would all try to be patriotic. Everyone in the press wants to seem patriotic, as we saw during the Persian Gulf War coverage.
Well, I was going to say that the Persian Gulf is the great example, and maybe whenever we go to war, the press drops all, in this country, drops all claim to objectivity and to neutrality. And it's especially evident, it seems to me, on television, where Dan Rather or Tom Brokaw will come and say, let us pray that our boys get home safely. And you're sitting there and saying, yes, I want to pray that our boys get home safely, but I also want to pray that everybody gets home safely. And so it's a whole different psyche that takes over, and I think it reveals something about the nature of the press and what's really going on there.
Well, I would just say that that's part of the story. I think the reason that the press in the Gulf War was as enthusiastic as Victor said it was partly that the Gulf War was very short. Now, 25 years earlier, we had the Vietnam War, which was quite long. And there was a turning point in that war. I think it came about 68, and the Tet Offensive had something to do with it, after which the press became very skeptical and very oppositional to the same degree that it had been supportive. So I think it's a little wrong to say that we're all super patriot reporters over here.
Okay, we have a question over here. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Ben Jacob, and I'm a freshman at Tufts University. My question is directed to the students in the panel in Moscow. In light of the new political reforms and economic reforms being proposed by Boris Yeltsin, how is the press reacting in Moscow right now, and do you feel the students that you're getting the full story?
Okay.
I'd like briefly to answer your question. As to how these reforms are being carried out, anybody can see that. The press cannot deceive someone about how reforms are going on. Everybody feels and sees how the reforms are taking place. So I'd like to add something. You and then you. I think that in our country, the press is very often used for political purposes by various groups and forces. I think that right now this is very clearly visible. I want to add something. I'm Marina from the Journalism Department of Moscow University. When you talk about objectivity, I think it's hard for us to do that, since we don't know how many facts are in fact passed over in silence. So we can't really talk about objectivity. We only know what we know. What we don't know, we don't know. I wanted to go back to the problem of freedom of the press. Right now, some public organizations in our country are planning to institute a criminal case against a number of journals, including newspapers, including Pravda and Soviet Russia. They're being accused of inciting to hatreds among the nationalities, of inciting to the overthrow of state power, and the whole case connected with the Committee on the Emergency Situation. Do the Americans No. In the history of American democracy, have there been cases when there were political lawsuits instituted against newspapers and when newspapers were closed for political reasons? Thank you.
Well, indeed. Nick.
Yes, there certainly have been cases of that sort. One of the famous ones goes back to the 18th century when John Adams tried to shut down opposition newspapers by having the Congress pass a law against sedition. But there are more recent cases as well. There was a case during the First World War, for example, where a number of socialists threw out handbills encouraging people to avoid the draft. They were arrested and spent a considerable time in prison. All of this raises the question, of course, to what extent can you allow the press to be an agitator of unrest in society? And in the United States, we have allowed a considerable amount of freedom in this area. For example, the Supreme Court has allowed people to burn the American flag as a symbol of protest. On the other hand, one of our justices of the Supreme Court has said, and I think this is a true and wise observation, that no one really has the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. So you have to find some kind of delicate balance between allowing the greatest freedom of expression, but at the same time not allowing it to go so far that people actually get physically hurt.
Okay, thank you. A question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Tracy. I'm also from Tufts University. I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to ask a question of the Soviet panel. Could you describe the role of the Soviet press in accelerating the glasnost reforms?
You, the American colleagues here, what you have is your regular life. We have a struggle going on. That struggle is reflected in the press. Neutrality of the press means death for it. In our conditions, when there is no neutrality in life, a revolution is going on. Peaceful, democratic, but it is a revolution going towards a new system of power. That is why the fundamental position of a journalist is that of this kind of need without which we can't live. We all just have a minute here. I think that in the Soviet Union, we don't yet have a broad democratic field of action. Today, we've dealt with life in the various republics. We could also talk about the problems of Russia, in which very often issues are resolved not through law, but through the will of the president or those around him. I think this is an illness of a young democracy. I think we will recover from that illness. I hope that we will have that democratic space in which the press will be able to feel that it is genuinely independent and able to express the point of view of those of its readers who, in fact, have a relationship with that newspaper. Academician Verhoeven, as a reader, I must say that, of course, despite all our problems, all our drawbacks, I think a decisive role in the reforms is being played by our press. What can I say? What Perestroika has brought to this country a great many good things, but the most important thing, one of the most substantive things, is the new press. That is clearly so, and what saves our politicians from those numerous mistakes which they're making and which they're planning to make is also the press. I think that an enormous role, particularly today, in this country, despite all our weaknesses, is being played by a free and independent press. Martin, I think that the events from the 19th to the 21st of August, those people, and primarily those young people who came out to defend the White House in Moscow, they defended first and foremost the right to speak and the right to be heard as the most important gain of democracy at this stage. And I think that here we have done what we had to do.
Well, thank you. And I agree. The role of a free press and a critical press, which is free, is absolutely essential to democracy. I think we've seen that over 200 years in the United States. It's often been threatened, but the system itself and the culture itself has managed to sustain not only the First Amendment, but a great deal of other institutions that promote the freedom of the press. And we certainly look forward to the day when you have the kind of structures that protect the press, which looks to us from this point to be emerging in the right direction, to be very vigorous and to be very free. And we not only wish you a great deal of luck, but I think we all honestly feel that if there's any way that we can help, we will be very happy to do it. So I think everybody will be getting subscriptions, or at least some of you, not everyone, some of you will be getting subscriptions to The Nation and to the National Review and perhaps to other American magazines. Thank you very, very much to all the students in both audience and to the panelists in the United States and to the panelists in the Soviet Union.
We still have 2 minutes. We'd like to say we're very grateful to you for participation in this conversation. I'd like to say that we've tried to be open. We did not very much even spare the honor of our uniform. I think that we have a new generation here coming in. These are going to be new journalists. This is going to be a new kind of glasnost and a different image of the press. Let's together welcome this and wish them all success. Thank you all very much.
Major funding for this program has been provided by the people of United Technologies, who provide a broad range of products and support services to the global aerospace, building systems, and automotive industries. Additional funding was provided by Tufts University, the Nation Institute, and the Freedom Forum, a financially independent international organization dedicated to free press, free speech, and free spirit for all people.